Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical Society's president and CEO, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's virtual program, The Fantastic City, Bruce McCall's New York. Tonight's program is presented in conjunction with our New York Historical Exhibition, Bruce McCall's New York, which is on view now through August 15th. This special conversation is a part of our Bernard and Irene Schwartz Distinguished Speakers Series, which is the heart of our public programs. As always, I'd like to thank Mr. Schwartz for his great generosity and leadership. Just before I introduce our speakers this evening, I want to thank and recognize Mr. Richard Reese, who is the chair of our executive committee and a New York Historical Trustee, and also to welcome Bruce McCall and his daughter Amanda McCall and all of their family and friends who have joined us this evening. I'd also like to thank members of our Chairman's Council for their encouragement and support, especially at this challenging time. Now then, we are thrilled to be welcoming Adam Gopnik back to our stage, our virtual stage, that is, this evening. He's been writing for The New Yorker since 1986. During his more than 30 years at the magazine, he's written fiction and humor pieces, book reviews, profiles, and reporting pieces on the United States and abroad. His books range from essay collections about Paris and food to children's novels. He's won the National Magazine Award for Essays and for Criticism 3 times, and also the George Polk Award for magazine reporting. In addition to writing the foreword to Bruce McCall's memoir, How Did I Get Here?, Mr. Gopnik crafted the text on the introductory panel to our exhibition and is also a lender to our show. We are also very pleased indeed to welcome Andy Borowitz, a New York Times bestselling author and a comedian who has written for The New Yorker since 1998. In 2001, he created the Borowitz Report, a satirical news column for which he won the first ever National Press Club Award for Humor. He's the author of numerous books, including the best-selling The 50 Funniest American Writers and An Unexpected Twist. His solo comedy show, Make America Not Embarrassing Again, played to sold-out theaters across the United States from 2018 to 2020. We are very grateful indeed to Mr. Borowitz and Olivia Gentili for their generous support of our exhibition, Bruce McCall's New York. Tonight's program will last an hour, including 15 minutes for questions and answers. Your questions can be submitted tonight via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. In the interest of simplicity, we've disabled the chat function tonight, so please do remember to use the Q&A. Our speakers will get to as many questions as time allows. And now I am happy to turn our virtual stage over to tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. It's wonderful to be here again. Is this possibly the last Zoom, Andy? I seem to have been
I certainly hope so.
I suspect it may be.
If not, I think that was the whole point of the vaccination, was we wouldn't have to do Zoom again ever, right?
Well, I think some people prefer it. I know Martha, my wife, actually has preferred living on Zoom, and I think she never intends to return to the actual world. It's so good to see you. Now, you're up in New Hampshire?
Yes, we live in Hanover, New Hampshire.
It's still chilly. It's still chilly up there, I see.
It is a little chilly. It is a little chilly. As you can see behind me, though, we have several Bruce McCalls. I guess you lent your Bruce McCalls to the exhibit. We are hoarding our Bruce McCalls up here. We're survivalists in New Hampshire. We hoard things.
Yes.
So this is what Amanda, Bruce's daughter, calls my McWall, actually, because it's a wall of McCalls.
You're New Yorker magazine survivalist. You have to have McCalls, a few chasts, one or two.
Exactly, for the end times, you know, from my cold dead hands. So Adam, I guess I'm such a joy. I actually have not really spoken to you during the entire pandemic. So I think it's good that we're doing it in public now.
Absolutely.
We're being exhibitionistic about it. I guess I wanted to begin by sort of giving the audience a little bit of background. I've known Bruce for 25 years, but I think that makes me kind of a novice compared to you. Like, how long have you known Bruce McCall?
I've known Bruce 34 years, I guess, 34, 35 years. But I feel that I know Bruce in an even deeper sense because we are fellow Canadians.
That's
we are
right.
both Canadian emigres to New York, and which is very much the spirit and the beating heart of this exhibition. And we're also fellow hockey failures. That's a very important category in Canadian life. We both had ankles too weak to sustain normal skates. I should add as well, Andy, what many in our audience may be unaware of, which I'm sure Bruce and perhaps even Polly are aware of, that we're speaking today on an extremely auspicious morning or afternoon in Canadiana, because one of Bruce's great themes is the unimaginable melancholia of Toronto life. And last night, the Montreal Canadiens, the team with which I live and die, defeated the Toronto Maple Leafs in the 7th game of a playoff series after having fallen behind 3-1. And it is without question the greatest choke in the history of the franchise known to choke most in the world. And I can only imagine what Bruce
that story kind of encapsulates Bruce McCall's worldview, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that the worst thing that can possibly happen does happen? Honestly, I guess I have some empathy for Bruce on that score, but I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, so no one really tops us in sports center. Yeah. You know what? I know that we were supposed to talk about art tonight, but let's just do an hour of sports talk radio, Adam, because I think that's what everyone is lined up for.
I suspect so, but it is one of the most beautiful things in all of Canadian literature is Bruce's account of his family's Hajj, their migration to Toronto from Simcoe, Ontario, where the kids, all the many, many McCall children are expecting an ascension to cosmopolitan paradise and instead find themselves in a gray gulch of melancholia and mediocrity. But maybe before we come to discussing those Macallian themes, we should take a look at a few of the New Yorker covers that are decorated.
We're going to look at a bunch of them. Now, this is one of the all-time classics. This is obviously the Abe waiting to audition for King Kong, right?
Absolutely, and it strikes a very McCall-like theme, which is the mundane side of the fantastic. If you want to have a monkey on top of the building, you have to look at a lot of monkeys. Next slide, please. I got a PhD in art history, just saying that, Andy. Next slide, please.
Next slide. This is obviously Bruce was walking by some second story gym at some point and thought, what if one of those took flight, I guess. But what's interesting about all of these, and I think it sort of puts us at a disadvantage, is that any kind of description we make of these pictures sort of takes away from the joke, because we're explaining how great the jokes are, and that's a bad role to be playing. So maybe you have to just say next slide.
Please. Next slide, please. This is I will add only that often in Bruce's work, and some of the most beautiful of Bruce's work, it's not as in this one, though there's a joke. The magic of the image and of the art is not in the joke, but it's in the exquisite, detailed, maniacally detailed rendition of the image. That's what makes it a McCall rather than just a gag.
There's a story behind this cover. I actually know kind of a little bit of the backstory, as we say in Hollywood. Bruce had done this painting for a New Yorker cover, and the New Yorker sat on it for a couple of years. And Bruce, one of the things he would grouse about from time to time when he and I would have lunch would be, he did this great picture and the New Yorker, had just been sitting on it. But what happened, and this is a real case of artistic serendipity, because they'd been sitting on it, and then a few years ago we just had this monumental dump of snow. And so it made David Remnick look like a genius, because then suddenly he had this unbelievably brilliant McCall to put up. And when I remember, we had this tremendous dump of snow like on a Thursday, and then this somehow was the cover on Monday. And I was like, Bruce, how on earth did you cook that up? And it just turned out to be, in comedy, timing is everything.
It is indeed. I actually did the comment, the opening editorial for that issue, because it was about the scientific discovery that all snowflakes actually are alike. It's true, by the way. Next slide, please. That is true. In with complications. Here's Easter morning, where the pterodactyls all get loose. They're all resurrected from the Natural History Museum, where you can still see the statue of, and this is again, what makes McCall McCall, right? It's not just to sketch the Natural History Museum. The Teddy Roosevelt Memorial, soon to be removed, abducted, is there in great and painterly detail. Bruce never misses a moment of the necessary rendition in the building behind the what is that called? That's what is that? The Westmore, the Bryn Mawr, the great apartment building on 81st in Central Park West. Someone will remind me, is there as well. Next slide, please. And this is museum parking from 2009. You know, one of the fascinating things for me when I was writing the introduction to Bruce's most recent book, volume of memoirs, is that in it, he talks in great detail about the mid-20th century illustrators who inspired and influenced him. And I had always thought of these things as being sort of, oh, the Beresford. Thank you very much, the Beresford.
Oh, there you go.
Somebody should write a book about New York apartment names. There used to be one down on Second Avenue called the U.S. Congress, if you recall it. But Bruce, I had always thought of these as being sort of generically mid-century magazine and advertising illustration. But if you're in the book, Bruce goes in great detail about the specific people, specific illustrators who invented all of these styles. So the flying car that we see in this bit of museum parking, that's not just any flying car. That was a flying car inspired by, I can't recall, again, clearly this is my Alzheimer's moment. Couldn't recall the name of the apartment building or the illustrator, but all of Bruce's art comes out of this kind of detail. It's not his study exactly, it's something that's got so deep into his heart and mind that it's always available to him.
Next slide.
Please.
There we go.
That's what they teach in graduate school. And here's gluten-free glutton about the collision on a New York street of good health and poor health with the wonderful thing, hot, fat, and greasy. And
I think we know which side of the divide Bruce associates with something else. Bruce is, in my experience of Bruce, he is kind of a steak eater. He looks upon vegetables the way Dracula looks upon Wolfbane, or maybe I mix that up. What is Dracula not like?
Garlic.
Like sunlight. Garlic.
It's not like garlic.
Werewolves don't like Wolfbane, of course.
Right.
Of course. And it's the Beresford. It's all coming back to me now.
It's the Beresford, and now the name of the illustrator will come back to before we go
Always.
on. But all of this, and I think that's the last of our first slides, isn't it? All of it. Next slide, please. Or there's no. Yes, there. That is the end of it.
We'll look at some slides a little bit later. I guess.
Brings to mind. We'll have more slides. It's a kind of media event. But all of it brings to mind what is, I think, for me, what makes Bruce an amazing artist. Obviously, it's all the ideas are always funny, and the ideas are always completely original and not conventional gag ideas at all. But Bruce is an artist for me, Andy, in the first instance. You know, let's step back a second, just for people who don't know Bruce's history and work. Bruce grew up in the town of Simcoe, Ontario, and then, as I said, moved to Toronto, Ontario, with an enormous family of brothers and sisters, and a peculiar but charismatic father, and a unhappy but very literary mother. And he details all of this story in Thin Ice, which I cannot recommend too highly. It's really one of the, not just one of the great Canadian memoirs, but one of the most beautiful memoirs I've ever read. And all the while he was dreaming of America in a way that only Canadians can, and particularly that only Torontonians of the deep, dark, gray Protestant dispensation, Scottish Presbyterians like the McCalls, can possibly imagine. And he made his way to America and eventually to New York. And his family, the one positive thing he always writes about is that his parents, with all of their deficits, his parents always had a subscription to the New Yorker. And that was always his bridge to a certain idea of sophistication and literary cosmopolitanism. And he made his way by way of being an advertising illustrator. You know, he was the guy who in the late 50s and 60s would be doing those impossible cars, you know, where you see the car from a low angle and it looks, it's about 40 feet long and above it. And then by way of the Lampoon and advertising work in New York, he found his way into the New Yorker. So behind all of Bruce's art is this incredible longing to arrive in New York, to get out of the provinces and get to the metropolis. And that's really the subject of what he does. And then it's this wild expertise in realist art, in the demands of photographic realism, which he then applies to his work. Forgive me, Andy, for that long foundational statement, but
that was very impressive. I enjoyed that. You know, I also read Thin Ice, which was a great book, and I remember Bruce, and I hope I'm getting this right, but he described his brief career as an advertising illustrator before he realized that wasn't for him, or vice versa. Bruce always has a way of making even his big successes sound like failures when he writes about them, which is a good trick that gets you on his side. But of course, he's had a fantastically successful career. But when he described the process by which artists in the 1950s you know, really before photography became the tool for selling cars, you know, you would read, I guess, magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, and there'd be a big Cadillac or, you know, whatever car brand they were selling, a big ad for them. It would always be this kind of fantastical, slightly exaggerated illustration rather than a photograph. And he described the process by which those pictures were created, which was they would take a photograph of a Cadillac, cut it into vertical strips. And then, this is before Photoshop, okay, where we could do this on our phone. And then they would spread the strips ever so slightly apart so that all of the dimensions of the car were slightly exaggerated, but just in a very subliminal way. So you weren't exaggerating it so much that somebody said, oh, that's a crazy cartoon image of a car. It just made you feel like the car might be incredibly capacious and like you really want that car. And so Bruce, once he realized, you know, Bruce is a great example of somebody who, and I think a lot of great artists are like this, you know, they can't follow the rules really well because they're creative. So Bruce being cast as an advertising illustrator was sort of miscast because his imagination is too capacious. He has this very big imagination. And so what he wound up doing, and it's available in a lot of his books that feature a lot of really funny car illustrations and funny car ads, he started creating these sort of bulge mobiles, as he would call them, like these fantastical Bruce McCall versions of cars. But much like a lot of the pictures we just looked at, they're just one step removed from reality. They're just, that's the key, I think, with his art and also his writing. You know, there's this crazy misconception about comedy, that comedy is all about exaggeration. Actually, it's almost the opposite is true. I think comedy, Jim Bouton, who wrote a baseball player, wrote a very funny book called Ball 4. He once said to me that he thought comedy was reality times 1.3. And I think that's about right. I think it's like Bruce takes the reality, and, you know, what you were saying about, you know, the background is so incredibly realistic. The art museum, the Natural History Museum, is done to the T. And that's what makes the comedy really sing, because it's just this, you're immersed in this very kind of credible reality. And then there's just something wrong, but it's not wildly wrong. It's just one thing is wrong.
Well, if I may take advantage of my discarded art history background, I'm actually what they call ABD year 42. In other words, I'm 42 years late with my dissertation. Other than that, I got the degree. You know, that's a key to what is 20th century surrealism, right? That's what all the great surrealists always did. Max Ernst, René Magritte, and Bruce is very much the Canadian comic Magritte in that way. It all involves the deadpan, sober registry of the world as it is, with, as you say, some element that's impossible or eccentric or hallucinatory, and that's very much the spirit in which Bruce works. And that's the whole key to great surrealism, is the realism. It's the sur is the part that's added on. And that mastery of description and of illustration is extraordinary. Quickly about cars, one of the things that Bruce is identified with in our family is the automotive obsession. He's the only man we know who drives around New York the way you might drive around Simcoe, Ontario, or Shaker Heights, Ohio, or any other place, New York being the one place where you don't. And I swear that this is true. Whenever you meet Bruce for lunch, you meet him, he's in his car, and he finds a parking space. He keeps them someplace in his pocket. He knows how to find it. And this is actually both a hockey and a Bruce story. We were going to see a hockey game when my son Luke was about 9 or 10 years old. And Bruce, as I say, shares the Canadian obsession with hockey as I do. And as we emerged from our apartment building, Luke turned left and resolutely trudged towards the subway, as he had been doing every day of his life. And I said, no, Bruce is going to pick us up. And Luke looked at me and said, we're going by car? Because he had literally never had the experience of going someplace within New York City from home to elsewhere by car. It was a completely aberrant notion to him. But that was part of, that's part of Bruce's ability to cast his own stubborn spell on reality. He does it in life as much as he does it in art. I should point out here, because you've got the McCall collection, but I have got behind me the cover, the whole book, in fact, that Bruce and I did together. It's called The Steps Across the Water, and it was a fantasy that I wrote about a version of New York, an imaginary city, well, it's real in the book, called Unork, which began when my daughter Olivia, shares a name with Mrs. Andy, always when she was a little girl, did a kind of spoonerism. She couldn't say New York. She would always say, people would ask her, where do you live, little girl? And she would say, I live in Unork. And she was embarrassed about it. And I took that embarrassment and said, no, there really is a city called Unork. Only it's like New York, only it makes New York look like a suburb, because that's what Unork is like. And of course, the only person in the world who could adequately imagine and realize Unork was Bruce. And I begged him to do it, and very kindly he did. And the book is filled with his images of the beyond New York, Unork. What was fascinating about it is there was nothing so crazy or wild in this imaginary city with skyscrapers that are a mile high and restaurants where they shoot food directly into your mouth and so on, that troubled him for a moment. But getting a 10-year-old girl, because the protagonist of the book was a character named Rose, modeled on Olivia, getting a 10-year-old girl in a purple overcoat, that was hugely troubling to him, and he would not let it drop. In other words, it was never good enough, and he worked on Rose, and he worked on it over and over and over again. Getting it down right for him was beyond a task. It was an artistic responsibility. And he wrote once very beautifully, I wish I had the exact words in front of me, that for him, I remember now exactly what he said. He said, to get it down right as an artist, to solve a problem, a 10-year-old girl in a coat, the front of the Natural History Museum, was for a moment to have demystified the world. And I've always thought that was such a beautiful way of articulating it, that the world is a puzzle, and an artist could resolve that puzzle or solve that puzzle for a moment if you could just get it right.
I think that's pretty deep, and I also think that's pretty universal about why anybody does anything creative, because it's really, I've been thinking a lot about cave painting recently, which, by the way, the Neanderthals were really good at that. Every time we slur a Neanderthal, we're showing our own ignorance, because the Neanderthals were actually amazing artists. I'm not in any way comparing Bruce to a Neanderthal, by the way, I should just say that. But it would, if I did, it was a compliment. But I think that cave painting is basically what you and I and Bruce are doing all day. We're just leaving these marks behind, and it's very transitory, and maybe someday someone will stumble upon them. But I think for the artist, the process of doing it is very therapeutic, because it seems to be ordering this incredibly chaotic universe very briefly. And I think that that's why we enjoy consuming art, because again, we have creative souls like Bruce who are taking a topic like New York, which always seems to be kind of on the verge of spinning out of control, and Bruce reorders it in a more pleasing way. I sort of think of him, if you look at his style, I don't want to get into your territory, Mr. Art History Man, but I guess his favorite medium is gouache. I think he paints in gouache most of the time. And I think of like other artists who have a similar kind of, you look at their stuff and it makes you happy. It doesn't necessarily make you laugh, but I remember a few years ago going to see the big Wayne Thiebaud show that was going on. And I thought, well, that's also kind of a sort of a distant relation, or maybe not so distant relation of Bruce McCall, just because the colors and the representations, make you happy. They have that same, I don't know, it is kind of a mid-century feel, brightness, and there's a weird sort of balance in Bruce's art between kind of an optimistic portrayal of the world and then something very dark. There's a little bit of Edward Hopper under the surface somewhere. It's this very bright and sunny reality, and it is the world of 1950s advertising, where he's selling some product, and then when you take a closer look at the product, you're like, wait, do I really need that product? So it's a wonderful, as I would say, a reordering of the world in a way that kind of shows the absurdity of trying to even make sense of it all, because it weirdly does make sense and nonsense at the same time.
Well, it's fascinating to say that, Andy, because I think it's right. I think in a lot of ways, Bruce's work is a kind of collision of 50s optimism and 90s realism, about the world. Bruce, I've said in the past, and I believe it's true, that the New Yorker as an institution has, fathered and fostered countless remarkable artists, like our friend Roz Chast to Getz, and I could, 100 others. But it's really only fathered or fostered two great artists whose work can hang in a museum and is valuable just as a visual document as much as a conceptual document or a writerly document. It's a fancy way of saying that survive without any captions at all. And there's Saul Steinberg and Bruce McCall. Mm-hmm. And what I think Saul and Bruce had in common, though I cannot imagine two human beings who are more antipodial in personal manner, is that they both were obsessed with New York. And they both had a very particular dystopian vision of what New York is and what New York could be that was also absolutely fascinated. Neither of them could ever leave New York, as in the famous Steinberg, the world, New York is the world and the world is New York, that now iconic poster. But Bruce is something of the similar kind of relationship to New York, only it's to a slightly later New York. In Saul Steinberg's work is the kind of cool black and white 40s and 50s New York. And then suddenly there's this explosion, this kind of Banana Republic New York in the 1970s, Banana Republic, the Republic, not the store, in the 1970s, when the whole thing becomes, streetwalkers in those immense high heels and, odd, strange, disturbing acts of violence. And it's all shown in a kind of bright noon. Bruce, and that's very much was Saul's sense of the transformation of New York in the late 60s and 1970s. Bruce, I've always thought, is kind of the bard of the 1980s, of overkill New York, the New York of, God help us, of Donald Trump that began then. The New York of the 80s and 90s, where the madness and absurdity of the oligarchical reign and of the New York of the billionaires, which was tidied up, cleaned up, homogenized in lots of ways, but at core absurd. I always thought that Bruce, beyond the specifics of the individual panels and covers, which is so wonderful, always had that vision. And as you say, it derived from his experience of 50s optimism, particularly 50s Canadian optimism. So yes, and if I may, I have not seen you, Andy, since the pandemic began, but if I may, without flattery, say one of the great joys about reading the Borowitz Report for Martha, my wife, and me throughout this whole year has been that day after day, in the midst of this frightening insanity we've been going through, you somehow managed to diffuse the insanity just enough for us so we can pause, laugh, and go on to the next insanity. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm just painting my cave. That's all I'm doing.
Actually, doing. I mentioned doing comments about snowflakes. I did a comment for what's called the freezer issue last year. That's the issue that has to hang over for 2 weeks at the end of the year, so it can't be too topical, about the very first cave painting, which was discovered in Indonesia. And exactly so, it's a combination of stick figures representing people, and there's, what are they called, therianthropes, these imaginary combo human animal figures. And it's clearly these artists saying, we can dominate you. I'll make a monster and then I'll master the monster. I can do both things at once. And that, I think, is exactly what artists do. We make our monsters, then we dream of mastering the monster, then we feel better for a little while.
For a little while. I know that the show at the Historical Society is all about Bruce's work about New York, so I don't want to get too far afield from that. But I would urge anybody who's interested in exploring Bruce further to go back a little bit earlier than the 1980s, because I actually discovered Bruce's work in the National Lampoon. And Bruce was still at that time working in advertising. That's another sort of funny sidebar to his career. In addition to everything else he's done, all of the writing, all of the painting, everything, he also had this thriving advertising career for a long time. So he was sort of, it was like a mole, he was like on the inside. And I remember when I was in college on the Harvard Lampoon, which is kind of the ancestor of the National Lampoon, there was one page from the National Lampoon that pretty much everybody on staff agreed was the funniest thing ever done. And it was by Bruce McCall. And I've told Bruce about this, but it was a parody of, it's kind of something that a reference point that people maybe have lost now, but it was a parody of a page of teeny tiny ads from like a comic book or from like
the back of a comic.
Yeah. And when I was growing up, there were companies like the Johnson Smith company that would like sell you novelties like X-ray specs and things like that. And I was a sucker. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I would like send in my $2 and get back some piece of trash that they were, suckering me into buying. But I remember it was like, it had all these ridiculous pitches for careers that you could have. And one of them turned out to be prescient because it was offering you a great career in firing people. And they had this guy behind a desk and he was saying like, hey, bub, you're out of here. And then that was like that of course now is a career. It's actually also, a reality show we're familiar with. But and I remember there was another really great, it's always hard to describe visual jokes, but these are all teeny tiny ads. And one was a picture of this gigantic pile of lumber, this huge pile of lumber, and then a teeny tiny guy standing next to it with a clipboard. I think the ad pitch was lumber counters eat steak. And it was the idea that there was a job of counting lumber that was highly remunerative.
And it was one that would get you to the steakhouse, right?
So again, it was one of those things of like incredible optimism and a completely ridiculous pitch. But of course, that's advertising. I mean, that is the absolute reduction of advertising to its core, which is we are selling you something you don't need by telling you that it will do something it won't do. and Bruce really captured that. But we looked at that. We were like, all in college. We looked at that one page of Bruce's work, and it was the densest. I'm sure it's available on the internet and some National Lampoon archive. It's one of the densest pieces of comedy I've ever seen, because in this one page of a magazine, there were 1 million jokes and it was perfectly rendered. And so when I finally moved to New York, about 15 years after college, and I got to meet Bruce, that was really quite a thrill. And then, to think now that I've actually gotten to know him and be friends with him for 25 years is beyond an honor. It's just incredible, because he really was, in my college years, just this kind of, iconic demigod, if I can put it that way.
I second, I know the piece and I second it. It's also so utterly typical of Bruce that every single detail on this satiric page, this mock page, would be of that kind. You mentioned, Andy, coming from Cleveland, and I don't want to reduce Bruce too narrowly to his identity, as we all do these days, but I do think it's significant that Bruce is Canadian, and Bruce is without question the most Canadian human being I've ever known. And I've grown up among Canadians, and truly, my wife's family are very, very Canadian, but Bruce is the most Canadian human being I've ever known. And there's something about that. And one of the ways in which he is Canadian is if he when we talk to him about this, he dismisses instantly all praise as pretension, right? I didn't do anything much there. Oh, you remember that old piece? That was ridiculous. I couldn't get it right. I got half the stuff. He has never taken a bit of praise in a self-fluffing way at all. And it's a deeply Canadian thing. But I do think it's significant that funny people usually come from the provinces. They come from Cleveland or they come from Canada to New York. I mean, the Canadian humor connection, the Canadian comedy connection is a legendary thing. It's Dan Aykroyd and Marty Short and Lorne Michaels. And Wayne and well, not Wayne and Schuster so much, but you don't even know who Wayne and Schuster are, do you?
I've heard of Wayne and Schuster.
Wayne and
Rosie Schuster. Isn't that Rosie Schuster?
That's right. Her dad. They were the great Canadian comedy team, laughed at only by Canadians who could truly grasp the niceness of their humor. But I, you know, that it's maybe partly accidental, but I genuinely think that there's a truth in that. I come from Canada as well, but not as regularly funny, that the combination of longing for and disappointed by is the key to what makes comedy work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're dead on. I mean, Cleveland doesn't have quite the storied history, although we do have people like Sandy Fraser, who's one of the great comedy writers for the New Yorker, and a bunch of other people. But I mean, I actually grew up across the Lake Erie from Simcoe, Ontario, and Bruce and I talk about that. I think that it's really important in comedy to have a chip on your shoulder in general, and I think that Cleveland, we talked a little bit about the sports problems we've had. We almost still can't believe that we had LeBron James for a brief shining moment and actually won something. It really made us kind of briefly reevaluate our identity. But I think that if you're the prom king, you're probably not going to wind up doing a lot of funny stuff for the New Yorker. You won't really feel the need to do that. You'll have other things going on. I think that it helps to feel kind of downtrodden, and some of it, I mean, even I think with Bruce, as we've said, so dazzlingly successful, but you never lose that chip on your shoulder. You never lose that sense of being one down and somebody trying to mess with you, and you have that sense of being a loser even if you are a winner. And I think that's I mean, in a way, it's a gift. It's a creative gift because it's what drives somebody like Bruce to do what he does. But it's sort of one of those things where the rest of us get to enjoy his misery.
Yes, it's a cursory. And in the 30 plus years I've known Bruce, he's always taken for granted. And this exhibition shows the range of the amazing covers he's done for the New Yorker for so long. He takes it as written each time he sells a cover to the New Yorker, that it's the last cover he'll ever sell. You know, they don't want me anymore. They're not interested in anything I do anymore too. That's the last cover I'll ever sell to the magazine. I heard that in 1992. And I think that that's part of what makes Bruce interesting. And, I'd add something to that. I think your description of why, I mean, and it is funny to think, Andy, that Bruce on the Simcoe side of it saw Cleveland as a cross between Las Vegas and San Francisco, that if only you could get across Lake Erie to the glimmering Cleveland side of things, then
just amazing. Yeah, I mean, I do think that again, it becomes, when you grow up in a place like Simcoe or at Toronto, as Bruce described it, Toronto's actually, there's a case if there are any Torontonians out there today, it's a lovely city. Bruce's particular precinct of Toronto was not, as he described it. It sounded pretty dreary. But I think, growing up in Cleveland, it was also an era in the 70s where, our river caught on fire. That's a very bad look. So again, you have to find, it's like what Bruce does. You have to find the coping strategy for that. You have to turn it into a laugh. And it's like so much better if the joke's on you that you're also in on the joke. It's not as somehow not as painful. So I think that's the key to what most comedy is, and certainly key to what Bruce does.
I think that's right. I also think that one of Bruce's special gifts is most comedians hide the wound in some way. That's what the comedy is about. But Bruce, in his writing, in this most recent book and in Thin Ice and elsewhere, is actually very good at showing the wound in an unsentimental and not self-indulgent way at all. But his writing about his own untoward father and troubled mother and all that is deeply moving and extremely specific and accurate. And, if there's a pathos in all comedy, and I suspect there is, or in the life of every comic writer, Bruce is actually very good at boding forward some of that pathos. In the covers we've been looking at, the images we're looking at, the thing that always strikes me about Bruce's work is that note of achieved melancholia that comes through it. Even something as famous and wonderfully gaggy as the King Kongs waiting to audition has a deep kind of Chaplin-esque quality about it, because the poor they're giant apes who could go raging through a city, and they're sitting playing cards waiting for a casting call. or that beautiful one of the polar bears. What I remember best in front of the public library, what I remember best of that image is the violet New York sky on a snowy day. Those kind of long canyons and poignant emptied spaces of New York are very much part of what Bruce is able to convey to us. And I think that's one more of the ways in which Bruce is distinguished, is distinct from all of the wonderful gag makers, joke makers of the visual world. But I had nothing more honorable and noble than being a cartoonist. But Bruce is an artist, and I think it's exactly that ability to register the pathos of the joke along with the joke, the pathos behind the joke along with the joke, that sets him apart.
Well, we're going to take a few questions from our audience, but before we do that, we're going to look at a few more slides. And I want to say one thing as a non-art historian. I get what you're saying about the surrealists, but I think Bruce is the funniest painter in art history. I can't think of a funnier painter, because things like, Magritte, people like that, you look at them and say, oh, that's very witty and everything, but you don't really laugh out loud. So that's just, as a consumer of comedy, that's my bias. I think
that's right. I just mean that it's the comedy version of surrealism, as the Marx.
I agree. I'm just, I need to turn everything into a competition. So I'm just saying that.
Oh, just quickly before we go on to, it's fascinating you mentioned Wayne Thiebaud, who has done it on the occasional cover for the New Yorker, who turned 100 just a month ago.
Oh,
wonderful
my God.
painter. And I think that's a terrific comparison, because we think of Wayne Thiebaud doing the cakes and clowns and things that have that are soft, cosmetic, and yet his painterly vision has so much steel and music in it that it never feels soft or sentimental. And in that way, I think it does indeed resemble Bruce. So this is open season. This is again wonderful, just as an evocation of a New York street in autumn, quite apart from the beauty of the idea.
Next slide, please.
Everybody goes to Brooklyn.
Yes.
In 2019.
So great. Shall we move on? Should we go to the next slide?
Next slide, please.
I love this.
Horses. Yes, absolutely. The horse is getting right. And once again, that is the skyline of New York as you see it from the Great Lawn. Precisely.
Yes.
2014's version of it anyway. And here's some drawings. One of the things that's fascinating, when Bruce and I were working on the steps across the water, there would always be a pastel before there was a painting. Bruce really has kind of 19th century Beaux-Arts habits of work.
So it's like a study, right?
Absolutely. And the study in pastel, which are themselves exquisite and collector's items.
Next slide, please.
Here again, this is the study for the drawing stage, the pastel for Times Square pasture.
All right, let's go to the next. Here we go.
And this was the actual mural that Bruce had on 8th Avenue for a while. And I remember coming back to the city, I think we were living in Paris at that time, and seeing, said, oh my God, that's Bruce's work. It was a true, it's a shame that it wasn't a permanent piece.
Next. Oh, is that it?
Yes, now I think we have questions.
I think Louise is going to be the MC here. So let's
indeed. And first of all, let me say thank you so very much to both of you. This has been a great evening, and we've certainly covered a lot of ground, from Dracula and garlic to surrealism to comedy to what makes an essential Canadian to really what the two of you have referred to as an optimism somewhere, whether it's 50s or not. And I just want to say before I get to the question that we started thinking about the show, suggested to us actually by our good friend Ron Chernow, and we were pursuing it under any circumstances, but after the pandemic, it was very clear to us that we wanted to do this show right away. Somewhere underneath it all, we thought we retrieved and recognized, above all, a kind of optimism that New York needed right now, and that's really what motivated us. So once again, thanks. And now to the questions. For both speakers, this questioner would like to know what it's like working with each other and with Bruce at the New Yorker. So whichever one of you wants to begin, jump in, please.
Well, I think Adam can speak more to what it's like working with Bruce, although I don't know if they've ever actually collaborated at the New Yorker. I know they've done other stuff together. I have actually really just performed with Adam Gopnik. We've done some shows together for the New Yorker, for the New Yorker Festival. We both are long-standing participants in the Moth storytelling group, so we've done that. But Adam, you and I have never, other than in our capacity as ham bones, I don't think that you and I have ever collaborated on anything. But maybe you could talk a little bit about. And I sadly have never collaborated with Bruce. I've just been an acolyte.
Well, I think one of the most frequent illusions about the New Yorker is that anybody at the New Yorker knows anybody else at the New Yorker or ever sees them or knows them. I have a letter from a psychiatrist speculating on the resemblance between a piece I wrote about a psychiatrist and a piece Dan Maneker, and it sort of posited on the idea that we were in constant daily contact, sharing ideas. And I don't think I've seen Dan, who's passed on in 20 some years. So that I think tends to be the model. Andy and I both have escaped from that prison by becoming storytellers, but that was our life away from the magazine. I have worked with Bruce on this wonderful book. I mean, the drawings are wonderful. I think the story I hope is good. Steps Across the Water. And again, it's the same thing we've been talking about all night. The experience of working with Bruce on a work of high-spirited, high-hearted satiric fantasy was as gloomily Torontonian as anything could be, because he's a serious artist, right? The question was not, how isn't this fun, but how do we make it wonderful? And it was all turning on detail. He was reading the book very closely, and the book is filled with fantastical images, but Bruce had to make those specific, discrete, and concrete, and that's what we did. Apart from that, of course, we've had for years we've celebrated Thanksgiving with Bruce and his wonderful wife Polly, who brings every imaginable Thanksgiving treat here. And Bruce always wrote a long doggerel poem celebrating that particular Thanksgiving. One of his gifts is for doggerel poetry. And I'm sad to say, Bruce, we have saved them all over the years. So there's an enormously generous and loving person. But when it comes to work, Bruce is a door Presbyterian Scot.
Okay, well, that addresses perhaps another question, which is what Bruce is like on a personal level. Is he stoic, gregarious? Does he have a wicked sense of humor in person, or does he reserve his humor for his art?
I would say that it's complicated. First of all, I think Adam and I wouldn't be here if this weren't the case. He's the best friend anybody could hope for. I mean, I was actually seriously ill about 13 years ago, and Bruce won the award for most hospital visits, and he by a long shot. And the reason I bring that up is because Bruce sometimes presents as kind of a gruff, brusque fellow, that he has this exterior that can sometimes make you think, oh, Bruce is, this, kind of a prickly guy. He's not at all. I mean, that's, I think that's it's a very funny aspect of him, a very entertaining aspect of him, but there's no one sweeter and kinder and more generous than Bruce. I think that he's what Adam described earlier about his tremendous pessimism and negativity about his prospects and his work and his future. I can completely co-sign that, but it took me a while when I first started going out to lunch with Bruce. I would at first really take it at face value when he would say he was in an artistic rut and nothing he was doing was any good and it was all over. And then the next time I had lunch with him, he said, well, I just sold 5 covers to the New Yorker. And it's like, wait a minute. So then I realized, I do think this is true of artists in general and writers and people in a lot of the creative fields. There is this kind of mood swing that we go through. And I think with Bruce, it's sometimes he expresses it more, but any number of us have really bad days where we just think we're just not going to be able to crack this one. And then something that's just part of the process. I think something then unlocks, but Bruce is just much better at being open about it and being very expressive about it. So he's very much an open book. I don't think that Bruce is at all coy. I don't think I would ever use the word coy to describe Bruce. What do you think, Adam?
All of that is true, and there's no one I have turned to or would turn to in a crisis or a depression faster than Bruce. He's the most loyal and loving friend. And I should add too, he's the most, of all the men I know, he's the most, what's the word, uxorious in his devotion to his wife, Polly. He's a fantastic father to his daughter, Amanda, deep, and to his many siblings, all of whom have complicated stories. He's constantly attentive and caring. And I remember very well when we were living in France, Bruce arrived to do a tour of the Normandy battlefields with, or maybe it was the World War I battlefields with one of his brothers. And exactly, I think that's exactly right. I also say, I think that Bruce's legendary self-deprecation is an artist's way of refusing to become self-infatuated. If you think well of yourself in Simcoe, someone's going to bring you down a few pegs, and Bruce never wants to be in that position. He's dispensed with all of the strut and show-off qualities of being an artist while remaining one, and deeply, deeply lovable as a consequence.
Great. So here's a question. Would you please comment on Bruce as a comic writer? Many in the audience may be familiar with pieces he's written in the New Yorker through the years.
Well, it's funny. You mentioned earlier that I did this anthology of the 50 funniest American writers, Mark Twain and S.J. Perelman and the whole lot of them. And Bruce was on that list, not because he's a friend of mine. It was actually a list that the Library of America had compiled, and they basically gave it to me to see if there was anybody who I wanted to X out or add. But I mean, I think it's a tribute to Bruce that he made the list of 50 funniest American writers when he's really Canadian. So I don't know, maybe the Library of Canada will do a similar anthology and he'll get a twofer. But I think there's a real relationship between his art and his writing. First of all, we all need to take a step back and realize how unusual that is, that he is both a visual artist and a verbal artist. In terms of the New Yorker, really, Thurber is about the only other person who's done it, Tenny, that I can think of, unless I'm forgetting somebody, Adam. But I think that it's so unusual. It's kind of different parts of the brain. Usually great visual artists are not great writers and vice versa. It's an unusual combination of talent. But I think that his writing sort of comes from the same kind of mindset of this, fantastical, slightly surreal, definitely birthed by the world of advertising. I would say that his writing generally, it's the word I would use to describe it is he has a snappy sense of humor. It's never ponderous. It's always, he gets right to the joke, and oftentimes, and it's this love of words and the love of the way the words sound. I mean, the only other person I can think of who's written for the New Yorker who sort of worked in that same area was S.J. Perelman, who was so infatuated with language, and he would write sentences for the sake of how funny they sounded. And Bruce would always talk about, they're just phrases he would use, like jackbooted goons and things like that. He just had these catchphrases that would recur, and jackals, and just it's really worth it to for somebody to pick up go to the New Yorker archives and read some of his shouts and murmurs, and topical humor doesn't usually age very well, sadly, since that's what I've devoted a lot of my time to. But Bruce's stuff really holds up because it just occupies this kind of Bruce McCall universe. It's sort of like crazy advertising lingo, and does lots of multiple choice quizzes and stuff like that. It's just really quick, fast, to the point, hilarious. So there you go.
Great. A number of our audience members tonight are noticing, we can't see them that clearly, but it looks like you've got 3 Bruce McCalls in your backdrop. Andy, you want to quickly tell us about them?
Maybe I could actually walk over. Do you want a little gallery talk? Should we do that? Let's see what happens. Now the whole show is really going to hell because I picked up my computer. But this is, as you'll see, these are rooftops in New York, and they're individual Scrabble pieces are on the rooftop. So That's, I believe, from the early 2000s. There was a lot of talk about redoing the West Side Highway. And this was, Bruce, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is called the New West Side, and it's got all kinds of crazy parking structures and water vehicles and stuff. This one is a part of sort of corporate history that we now has, it's like sort of, I guess it's been superseded by reality. This was when Mercedes bought Chrysler, right? So they're adding the Mercedes symbol to the top of the Chrysler building. So that's my little that's my McWall, as Amanda McCall would say. I'm not going to give you the tour of the rest of my house. That you can go to Zillow for that and check that out, I guess.
That's great. Well, I think we have time for one quick answer, perhaps from you, Adam. Anyone who comes top of mind to you who's been inspired by Bruce McCall, either indeed or in just how they approach their own work?
I think an entire generation of writers, New Yorker writers. I think of Roz Chast, of Andy, certainly of myself, Patricia Marks. We've all been emboldened by Bruce, I think, to be our most audacious surrealist selves, but also I think empowered by him as a human being to recognize that there's no contradiction between being perpetually decent and being forever funny. That was something that was often, troubling for people from the kind of the Dorothy Parker generation. They didn't know how to get past being mean and still be funny. And Bruce has given all of us an example of how you can be the nicest guy in the world and still be the sharpest knife in the drawer. And I'd add only to what Andy was saying about Bruce as a writer, that in addition to his comic pieces, his casuals at the New Yorker, those 2 volumes of memoir, Thin Ice and How Did I Get Here, which just came out, and I actually was privileged to write an introduction to, are funny books, but they're not primarily funny. They're deeply, deeply moving, intelligent, and in some places almost tragic family memoirs. And I cannot urge them on people passionately enough. Thin Ice and How Did I Get Here? They're if I would bet that they may survive as long as any of Bruce's work.
Well, look, we've run out of time, very, very sadly, because there are a lot more questions, and the audience has been thoroughly engaged in this conversation, and I thank both of you for dazzling us this evening. I wish we had time for the rest of the questions, but perhaps you'll join us again, not on our virtual stage, because come fall, we're back on our real stage, and we hope you will join us there. And in the meantime, thanks again. Really, thank you so very much to both of you. You've given us a lot of insight into a great artist and a very profound and great human being. And thanks so much to our audience for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.